feel no ways tired. I didn't understand it then, but I sure understand it now. I don't feel tired. I'm ready to march. I'm ready to move. I'm ready to make a difference. Let's change this country. Thank you.
Henrik Madian from IUPAT.
IUPAT's in the house? Where you at? Somebody say something. I'm Ken Rick Maiden, General President of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. We're a building trades union. You may think it's unusual for us to be here, but with me, growing up with a father, with a mother who looked like me, Black Lives Matter, don't they? Black Lives Matter? Black Lives Matter. I stand on the shoulders of my father and all black tradesmen who fought for better wages and conditions. Without their fight, I wouldn't be here today. Recently, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of IUPAT Local 1332. You may not think much about that. That's one of our unions that was a traditional African American union, formed over 100 years ago because they couldn't be in the regular union. But 100 years later, still up and fighting and a part of our organization. This is an opportunity for us because when I see the street, I don't just see people who look like me. I see America. And this is our opportunity to go forward and our opportunity to grow and our opportunity to have the country that has the vision that we have. All lives matter, but Black Lives Matter on top. Black Lives Matter first. Somebody say it, it's easy. Black Lives Matter.
7 bullets in a man's back at point range. A knee pressed into a man's neck for 8 minutes. How much pain must black people endure? When will justice prevail? When is enough enough? There is pain in this country, in Louisiana and Texas, after another hurricane, in California, in the midst of raging fires, across the country, Donald Trump, with 180,000 people dead from COVID. And in so many families' hearts over the shooting of Jacob Blake, there is pain. So, Reverend Sharpton, how many times over how many decades have I and my union joined in this journey for justice? The 63 March started as a labor march for jobs and justice. A. Philip Randolph and Byron Rustin invited Martin Luther King Jr. to speak that day. And King said, "We've come to dramatize a shameful condition." That shameful condition, prejudice, discrimination, economic inequality has not been cured. It's been metastasized. Underfunded schools, voter suppression, substandard housing, healthcare, and transportation, insufficient wages, high unemployment, discriminatory policing, mass incarceration. Black Americans who, whether from their higher rate of deaths from asthma or from COVID, have been struggling to breathe long before Eric Garner and George Floyd were suffocated at the hands of authorities. Justice and freedom must apply to all. The fight for opportunity and freedom must be all of our fights. And those of us who are white, we need to be real allies, real listeners, and real supporters. My synagogue's credo is the Psalm, and I quote, that the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. There is room for all of us, but we must call out those who cling so tightly to their privilege that is an oppressive tool against equality. So, my friends, my colleagues, November 3rd is coming. We need to get in good trouble. We need to vote. We need to have hope. We need a president who will sign the bills that the House has passed to make this country more fair, more just, more equal. That is our job this day and every day. Thank you. And then I also, as you all know, need to recognize the Postal Workers Union.
Thank you. All right. Let's hear it for organized labor. Give them a round of applause. No time for them to speak, but the Postal Workers Union is in the house. Pray for our postal workers. Our next speaker in the Obama administration served as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Secretary of Labor, and now today, he is the chair of the Democratic National Committee. Our friend and brother, please welcome Tom Perez.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Reverend Sharpton and Martin Luther King III for your extraordinary leadership. Thank you to the National Action Network. Folks, I live in Maryland. We lost a remarkable person last year when my fellow Marylander and mentor Elijah Cummings passed away. And before he passed away, he reminded us all of our civic duty. He said, "When we're dancing with the angels, the question will be asked, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? Did we stand on the sidelines and say nothing? Or did we fight back? Did we fight back for justice? Did we fight back for equality? Did we fight back for Black lives?" By being here today, you are answering all those questions with a resounding yes. We are all fighting back, but our fight cannot end here. Just as we march to this mall, we must march to Congress, to the United States Senate in particular, to demand passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Just as we march to this mall, we must march to the ballot box or the mailbox to demand the leadership we deserve. And we must exercise the right that protects all others, the right to vote. As you well know, our nation is hurting right now. Our African American communities are hurting. We're hurting from a pandemic that has taken 180,000 lives, hurting from an economic crisis that has cost millions of jobs, from a climate emergency that threatens the air we breathe and the water we drink, hurting from an epidemic of violence and racism, a cancer of the soul. We're hurting from a knee on their neck, a bullet in their back, hurting from leadership that treats them like their lives don't matter. President Lincoln, you would not recognize today's Republican Party. Our African American brothers and sisters are not alone. Dr. King spoke of the inescapable network of mutuality. In this moment of crisis, so many Americans are bound together in the mutual struggle for justice, dignity, and opportunity. From the Native American tribes confronting the scourge of COVID and the delay of their stimulus funding, to Latinx children being separated from their parents at the border, to Asian Americans facing hate-fueled attacks, to working families across this country struggling with poverty. We can change all of this. With the right leadership, we can heal our wounds. We can turn hardship into hope, despair into dreams. We can advance racial equality and restore the soul of our nation. But only if we do it together. Movements are built by the many, not the few. They're built by the hard and unglamorous work of grassroots organizing. They're built, in the words of the late, great Julian Bond, by the marchers whose feet have grown tired, whose voices have gone hoarse, whose shirts have stained with sweat and dirt and blood. John Lewis, as you know, left us with these marching orders. So go to iwillvote.com, iwillvote.com, check your registration status, tell your friends, family, and neighbors to make a plan to vote. Remember, November 3rd is the last day to vote, but it's not the first day to vote. Make a plan. Get out there. Do not let your voice go unheard. Do not let your voice go uncounted. This is the most important election of our lifetime. And make no mistake, you have the power to decide the outcome. Thank you very much.
Today, we commemorate the 57th anniversary of the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I was born into an activist family with my parents, my aunts and uncles pushing me in a stroller through Bay Area streets marching for justice in the years following the March on Washington. This moment is a reminder that we must always honor the sacrifice of the leaders who made that march happen. From the names we know, like Randolph and Farmer, Young and King, to everyone who worked behind the scenes and sacrificed quietly but profoundly, far from the lights of history. I have to believe that if they were with us today, they would share in our anger and frustration as we continue to see black men and women slain in our streets and left behind by an economy and justice system that have too often denied black folks our dignity and rights. They would share our anger and pain, but no doubt they would turn it into fuel. They would be lacing up their shoes, locking arms, and continuing right alongside us to continue in this ongoing fight for justice. Thankfully, we don't have to wonder if we are making them proud, because a giant from that march and the civil rights era of that day, John Lewis, he lived to tell us how we're doing. In his parting essay, he wrote to all of us who hope to carry his legacy, quote, "In the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society." For Congressman Lewis, the brutal murder of Emmett Till is what shook loose the activist inside him. It was the start of a lifelong journey toward service and driving change, the same journey that countless young leaders are building upon as we speak. As John put it, Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. The road ahead, it is not going to be easy. But if we work together to challenge every instinct our nation has to return to the status quo, and combine the wisdom of longtime warriors for justice with the creative energy of the young leaders today, we have an opportunity to make history right here and right now. So thank you so much for inviting me to celebrate with you. Let's march on in the name of our ancestors and in the name of our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Let's hear it for Senator Kamala Harris. Our next speaker is one of the legacy original organizations that was here in 1963 in the person of Whitney Young. Please welcome the former mayor of New Orleans, the president and CEO of the National Urban League, Mark Morrell.
Black Lives Matter. I want to thank Reverend Al Sharpton and the National Action Network, my friend and brother, as well as Martin Luther King III, for assembling us here on August 28th in the year 2020. In 1963, courageous men and women descended on this site, led by 6 legacy civil rights organizations, including the National Urban League. At that time, the National Urban League was led by one of the great Americans of the 20th century, Whitney M. Young, Jr. He stated from this very place at that time and on that day, on August 28, 1963, that our civil rights, our voting rights, our rights to human dignity were not negotiable. We have come back on August 28th in the year of 2020, in this 21st century, to say today that our fight for racial justice is not negotiable. We're here today to say that transforming our criminal justice system and purging it of mass incarceration and systemic racism is not negotiable. That protecting our sacred right to vote from suppressors, be they legislators, be they presidents, be they Russians, is not negotiable. That defending our right to a living wage so that every American can live in dignity is not negotiable. That dislodging structural racism that infects every institution in American life is not negotiable. That equitably funding all of our schools so all of our children can learn, and providing them with computers and broadband connectivity, and they can live and thrive with their God-given talents is not negotiable. That a fair and accurate census so that all of us are counted in accordance with the Constitution is not in 2020 negotiable. That eliminating the structural and shameful disparate impact of COVID-19 in 2020 is not negotiable. That reforming police, both police policies and police culture, and reallocating funding to summer jobs for youth, to mental health services, to homeless services, and to end the violence against our black men is not negotiable. Hands up, I can't breathe. Hands up, don't shoot. In 1963, when they gathered on this site, brothers and sisters, just a few weeks before they gathered, that great civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, was assassinated on the front lawn of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. At that time, they were fighting a poll tax, a literacy test, I should say, that did everything possible to prevent us from voting. In 2020, we come here when the very success of 1963, the Voting Rights Act, has been gutted by the Supreme Court. We come in 2020 where Jacob Blake and George Floyd and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and too many black men and women, Breonna Taylor, have died or been disabled at the hands of the police. So we're here to make some demands. Number one, we want the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to pass now, not tomorrow, not next week, not next year. Say it, pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Number two, we want to pass the HEROES Act. Number three, we want to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And number four, we want to pass H.R. 40 to look at reparations in this country. November 3rd. So we have to walk, if we have to run, if we have to, we will vote.
Let's hear it for our brother Mark Morial of the Urban League, NUL.org. All right. Here to introduce the man who is the namesake of the person who spoke here August 28, 1963. Here to introduce one of our men of the hour, Martin Luther King III, is none other than the congressman representing the 9th Congressional District of Texas, Congressman Al Green.
Thank you, everyone. It is now my honor to introduce a man whose name is synonymous with the civil rights, human rights movement. A man whose father stood here 57 years ago. A man who followed his father's footsteps, and I was there with him to India where he traced the steps of Gandhi. A man who understands that this is a full-time job. He's not a part-time freedom fighter. He's not an everyday freedom fighter. He's an all-the-time freedom fighter. I'm here to introduce a man who's a Morehouse graduate, a man who knows what it feels like to suffer the pains associated with the human rights movement. When he lost his father at the age of 10, he could have given up, but he didn't. He stayed in and he has fought the good fight. I'm here to introduce the Honorable Martin Luther King III. Would you show him some love, please? If you believe in liberty and justice for all, stand up and show him some love. If you believe in government of the people, by the people, stand up and show him some love. Show Martin some love. Show his father some love, his mother some love, his wife Andrea some love, his daughter Yolanda some love. Show them some love. God bless you. God bless the King family.
Good afternoon. I am so honored to be here. But before I say something, I want you to hear from the future of our nation. The only granddaughter of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, my daughter and Andrea's daughter, Yolanda Renee King.
Should I relay this? Okay. Some of you may remember that 2 years at the March for Our Lives, I said, spread the word. Have you heard? All across the nation, we are going to be a great generation. That was in 2018. I didn't know what would hit us in 2020. A pandemic that shut our schools and put our young lives on hold. More killings of unarmed black people by police. Attacks on our right to vote. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression that we learned about in school. And more extreme weather than ever before. But great challenges produce great leaders. We have mastered the selfie and TikToks. Now we must master ourselves. Less than a year before he was assassinated, my grandfather predicted this very moment. He said that we were moving into a new phase of the struggle. The first phase was the civil rights, and the new phase is genuine equality. Genuine equality is why we are here today and why people are coming together all across the world, from New Zealand to New Jersey. He said that we must not forget the days of Montgomery. We must not forget the sit-ins movements. We must not forget the freedom rides, the Birmingham movement, and Selma. Papa King, we won't! My generation has already taken to the streets peacefully and with masks and socially distanced to protest racism. And I want to ask the young people here to join me in pledging that we have only just begun to fight. will be the generation that moves from me to we. We are going to be the generation that dismantles systemic racism once and for all, now and forever. We are going to be the generation that calls a halt to police brutality and gun violence once and for all, now and forever. We are going to be the generation that reserves climate change and saves our planet once and for all, now and forever. And we are going to be the generation that ends poverty here in America, the wealthiest nation on earth, once and for all, now and forever. We are the great dreams of our grandparents, great-grandparents, and all our ancestors. We stand and march for love, and we will fulfill my grandfather's dream. So, show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. Show me what democracy looks like. One last time. Show me what democracy looks like. Okay, then let's show them.
Hell yeah. Definitely, bro. Here's the link. If anybody wants to donate, you guys heard what he's about. I'm donating myself right now as we speak, so.
Of the conveners that actually are here today, and most of all, these families that have been impacted by police brutality and misconduct. So we've come to bear witness, to remain awake, to remember from where we've come, and to carefully consider where we're going. Whether you're here in person, online, or watching on MSNBC and other networks, thank you for joining us for this March on Washington. Together, we are taking a stand, and we're taking a giant step forward. Let me also thank Al Green for the very, very warm introduction, my dear friend. But we're taking a step forward on America's rocky but righteous journey towards justice. August 28th is a day to remember the triumphs and tragedies that have taken place in our historic struggle for racial justice. Today, we commemorate the March on Washington to Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where my father declared his dream. But we must never forget the American nightmare of racist violence exemplified when Emmett Till was murdered on this day in 1955, and the criminal justice system failed to convict his killers. 65 years later, we still struggle for justice, demilitarizing the police, dismantling mass incarceration, and declaring and determinedly as we can that Black Lives Matter. In our struggle for justice, there are no permanent victories. For on this day, 12 years ago, I was honored to address the Democratic National Convention in Denver. And on that night, on that evening in the Mile High City, our spirits were soaring as the Democrats nominated Barack Obama, who would go on to become the first African-American president of these United States. But the progress we celebrated then is imperiled yet again. Ballot box and the mailboxes to defend the freedoms that earlier generations worked so hard to win. In so many ways, we stand together today in the symbolic shadow of history. But we are making history together right now. We're marching with the largest and most active multi-generational, multiracial movement for civil rights since the 1960s. From high school students to senior citizens, Black as well as white, Latino, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islanders. Americans are marching together, many for the first time, and we're demanding real, lasting, structural change. We're marching together for time-honored goals and in timely ways. We are courageous, but conscious of our health. We are socially distant, but spiritually united. We are masking our faces, but not our faith in freedom. And we are taking our struggle to the streets and to social media. The nation has never seen such a mighty movement, a modern-day incarnation of what my father called the coalition of conscience. And if we move forward with purpose and passion, we will complete the work so boldly began in the 1960s. We're marching to overcome what my father called were the triple evils of poverty, racism, and violence. And today, those evils have exacerbated 4 major challenges that currently face our country. First, COVID-19 tragically has killed more than 175,000 Americans, disproportionately African American, Latino, and low-income people in every background. Second, more than 30 million Americans are unemployed again, disproportionately people of color. COVID-19 has laid bare the structural and racial inequalities in our economy that kept too many people trapped in the debt and poverty. Third, police brutality and gun violence are killing so many unarmed African Americans. Today, we march with their families and we say their names: George Floyd, Boham Jean, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Yusef Richardson, Terrence Crutcher, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, and so many others. And fourth, our voting rights are under attack. We must vigorously defend our right to vote, because those rights were paid for with the blood of those lynched for seeking to exercise their constitutional rights. They were paid for with the blood of civil rights workers, such as Sammy Young Jr., Goodman, Squirney, and Cheney, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Viola Luiso, James Reed. Those rights were paid for through the sacrifices made by heroes such as C.T. Vivian, Fannie Lou Hamer, Hosea Williams, and John Lewis. But since the United States Senate has failed to renew the Voting Rights Act, we have had to overcome a whole new trick bags of tactics to suppress our votes. Discriminatory voter ID requirements, cutbacks in early voting and vote by mail, voter purges targeting those who have missed several elections, and disenfranchising those who have served their time and paid their debt to the society. And now COVID-19 is making it dangerous, even deadly, to stand in line at polling places. We shouldn't have to risk our lives to cast our votes. We need to be able to do what President Trump does: vote safely by mail. But now we are struggling to overcome the dismantling of the U.S. Postal Service for the express purpose of suppressing our vote. Well, our challenge is to use this moment to expand this movement, a movement that not only raises its voice, but casts its votes, pursues its vision, and makes lasting change. The scripture says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Our vision is best expressed by a phrase we must never forget. That is the beloved community. With those words, my father, John Lewis, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, and so many other historic women and men envision an America whose dramatic practice is as good as its promise. An America where the triple evils of poverty, racism, and violence will be replaced by peace, justice, and shared abundance, and where hate and fear finally give way to help and love. To achieve that America, we need to raise our voices and cast our votes. Over the weeks ahead, culminating on Election Day, we need to vote as if our lives and our livelihoods, our liberties depend on it, because they do. No person, no people are more keenly aware of the risk of disenfranchisement than those who've suffered from it. There's a knee upon the neck of democracy, and our nation can only live so long without the oxygen of freedom. The strength must be exercised by more than rhetoric and more than marching. The simple challenge before us is that everyone can cast a ballot, and everyone who can must cast a ballot. And that ballot that is cast must be counted, and the result must be transparent and known to the whole world. And so today, I can call on everyone with the means to drive people to the polls, to make a plan for yourself, for your family and your neighbor, for those organizations and companies that care about democracy. I call on you today to offer your resources and your capacity to make sure every ballot is counted. If our forefathers were willing to die for the right to vote, we can work for the right to vote, and I will continue to call on you to act in the coming days. You know, my father was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, while standing in solidarity with poor working people, sanitation workers, whose slogans, "I am a man," was a statement that they were human beings with rights that should be respected and acknowledged. They were asking for safe working conditions, for a living wage, for recognition of their union, and for human dignity. They summed up their struggle with those 4 words, "I am a man." That simple but powerful slogan impairs movements today, from Black Lives Matter to Fight for 15 and to the Me Too struggle against sexual harassment and abuse. Movements of marginalized Americans are still trying to claim the dignity they've been denied. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for the dignity of work, and that fight is never ending. In 1963, the March on Washington demanded jobs and freedoms. In 1968, the Memphis sanitation strike workers demanded, and the Poor People's Campaign insisted that working people should not live and labor in poverty. Those fights foreshadowed our struggle today to make the minimum wage a living wage, not a poverty wage. And we are fighting alongside the frontline workers, sanitation workers, healthcare workers, grocery workers, transport workers, food service workers, and so many more. They are praised for being essential, but they are treated as if they're expendable. While standing with sanitation workers in Memphis, Dad said, so often we overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in professional jobs, of those who are not in the so-called big jobs. But let me say to you tonight that wherever you are or whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and worth. Now we have a president who confesses greatness with grandiosity. But my father knew better. Everyone, he said, can be great because everyone can serve. He understood the human yearning for recognition. And in his famous speech, he explained that everyone wants to be a drum major, the leader of the marching band. And he challenged us to channel our drum major instinct into becoming drum majors for justice. While we honor our history, we must be a living movement, not a monument. If Dad were here today, I'm sure he would implore us not to deify him or selectively quote him when convenient. He would want us to be drama majors for justice, to champion the ideals he promoted, racial justice. So gently but intently challenge us not to dwell upon the past, but to live and labor in what he called the fierce urgency of now. So if you're looking for a savior, get up and find a mirror. We must become the heroes of the history we are making. And us means all of us. In 1963, after my father spoke, Bayard Rustin, the architect of the march, asked the participants to join in demanding that Congress pass strong civil rights and voting rights laws. More than half a century later, we must demand that the United States Senate stop blocking passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act. And so when we conclude today, let's remember that it remember that this is the commitment march. In the spirit of 1963, I ask you to join me in pledging to act in 3 ways. First, because our civil and human rights are at stake in this election, I ask you not only to register and vote, but make sure that at least one other person registers and votes. Second, I ask you to commit to service and struggle in your community, from voter registration to raising the minimum wage, to demilitarizing the police. Get involved with one or more of many worthwhile struggles in your community. And third, I ask you to pledge, as my father and John Lewis did, to get into good trouble and do it nonviolently. Remember that in the fight against injustice, nonviolence doesn't mean passive acceptance. It means peaceful resistance. We must come together and join with the Black Lives Movement to raise our voices and say enough is enough. We must come with the Poor People's Campaign, the Climate Change and Environmental Justice Movement, the Women's March and Me Too movement, the Parkland students and March for Our Lives, and say enough is enough. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that the moral arc of it was also the first to say that it doesn't bend on its own. We must do some work ourselves. In the final year of his life, he wrote in his last book, "Where do we go from here, chaos or community?" Well, my sisters and brothers and dear friends, in this defining moment for our history and our country, we must answer Dr. King's question. Will our answer be chaos or community? I believe some have chosen the answer with chaos, including the current occupant in the White House today. But we who believe must choose community, because if we choose community, we can avoid watching the dream turn into a permanent nightmare. If we choose community, 50 years from now, people will say that we were able to redeem the soul of America and begin to fulfill the promise of democracy by systematically eliminating systematic racism and exploitation. My friends, if we choose community, we will be able to answer in the affirmative to the scripture. Here comes that dreamer. Come, let's slay him, and we shall see what will become of his dream. Finally, this afternoon, I want to say to you, not only do I come as a protester, but I come as a victim. My daddy was killed when I was 10 years old. Gunned down, you know that, by assassin's bullet. Some of you know, but may not know. 6 years later, my daddy's mother, my grandmother, was gunned down in the church while praying the Lord's Prayer. So I understand what it means to lose a loved one. But I'm so thankful that my grandfather and my mother and my aunts and uncles taught me about love, because Granddaddy used to say, I refuse to allow any person to reduce me to hatred. The man that killed my lovely wife and the man that killed my son, I refuse to allow them even to reduce me to hatred. I love everybody. I'm every man's brother. If we're going to resolve these issues in America, we've got to come together. Dad talked about it in that sermon, Levels of Love. He talked about all of them. I'm only going to talk about the highest level of love. That love that seeks nothing in return. That love that is totally unselfish. You love someone if they're young, you love them if they're old. You love them if they're black, you love them if they're white. You love them if they're Native American. You love them if they're Hispanic or Latino American. You love them if they're African. You love them if they're Asian. You love them because you know that God calls you to do that. And if we're going to resolve all of these conflicts and crises in America, we got to find a way to do it in love. Thank you, and God bless you. And let's keep on keeping on.
Hello, 57th March on Washington. I'm Joy Ann Reid from MSNBC, and I wish that I could be there with you today, as Reverend Al Sharpton is my colleague, my friend, my off-the-record pastor, and my big brother. I arrived in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York in 1986 at age 18, having left when I was 2. It was an era when Black Lives Matter meant Michael Griffiths, Yusuf Hawkins, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, Patrick Dorisman, and Gavin Cato. It meant the Central Park Five and the replacement of New York City's first black mayor, David Dinkins, with Giuliani time. A stay away if you're black Bensonhurst and Howard Beach, and Reverend Al Sharpton, who was the only one who seemed to know what to do and who cared enough to do it. A generation earlier, it was Jesse Jackson, and before him, Dr. King. But for my generation, it was Reverend Al.
Someone's mom is out here, and I love her. She's so amazing. I call her mom. She's so great. I had to go give her a hug. Pop, pop, pop. Fire all these racist cops. Fire all these racist cops.
Waaqa urjii uume, waaqa nama uume, bishaan uume, waaqni uumaa waan hundumaa tokkollee isa malee kan jiraatu hin jiru. Hundumtuu isaan malee jiraachuu hin danda'u. Oromootti
want? What do we want? What do we want? When do we want it? 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 All right. 57 years ago, in 1963, there was a struggle in Birmingham, Alabama. There was the assassination of Medgar Evers, the head of the Mississippi NAACP. In the middle of struggle and murder, they came to Washington to demand that the federal government give them a Civil Rights Act and voting rights. They marched that day, in a hot, blistering day like today, saying that as we struggle, we need legislation. And they stayed on that movement until they got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They came young and old. They came from the South. Many of them couldn't stop on the road to use a bathroom because it was against the law, but they came anyhow. Many of them couldn't stop and eat in a restaurant. They had to put their sandwiches in a paper bag because no restaurant would serve them because it was against the law, but they came anyhow. Many of them couldn't rest in a motel overnight, but they came anyway because it was against the law for them to stop. Because they came in '63, we were able to come back in 2020, riding whatever we wanted to ride, staying whatever hotels was available. They opened the door for us, but there's still some doors we have to open and some people we've got to straighten out. 2020. We must deal with those that want to rob our right to vote. And even though we are here in the midst of a pandemic, socially distancing, telling y'all to distance, and I keep saying spread out, we want to come to show with our bodies that enough is enough. When I was headed to George Floyd's funeral, I talked with Martin III, and I said, you know, maybe we need to go back to Washington. He said, well, let's talk it out, Reverend Al. As I was giving the eulogy, I announced this march. We didn't know how we were going to do it, how we were going to plan it, how many would come, but we did it. Why are we in Washington? I talked with one of the leading minds of our nation, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, and he told me that, Reverend Al, you got to understand that until there's federal legislation, every state will do what it wants to do. We have passed in the House of Representatives the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act. Now we need to pass that act in the Senate. We need Mitch McConnell and the U.S. Senate to meet on the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act, or we're going to meet you senators at the poll in November 3rd, whether we got to mail in, walk in, ride in, crawl in. We want our bill passed. Several weeks ago, John Lewis, an outstanding congressman, made his transition. Last time Martin and I were here, he was with us, John Lewis. He and Reverend Hosea Williams and Amelia Boykin went to the Selma to Montgomery March that got us the right to vote. And that right lasted till 2013, when they took and gutted out the middle of that bill, taking away the map. Well, we come to Washington saying, how do you memorialize John Lewis and allow the bill that he stood for us to die? We want the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill for the Congress. So we didn't just come today to have a show. Demonstration without legislation will not lead to change. We didn't come out and stand in this heat because we didn't have nothing to do. We come to let you know, if we will come out by these numbers in the heat and stand in the heat, that we will stand in the polls all day long. They keep telling me about how it's a shame that black parents
Sorry guys, I'm not really paying attention. I'm playing guitar.